How badly is Scotland going to be hit financially if it becomes independent?
Our calculations suggest that the UK as a whole faces a significant fiscal challenge because of a loss of oil revenue and an ageing population over the next 50 years. And even under the most optimistic scenario we consider, that challenge for Scotland would be significantly greater because oil revenues would be much more important to Scotland, so their loss would hurt them more, and the Scottish population is ageing faster than that of the rest of the UK.
So what will that mean financially for the average Scot?
What it means is that for the UK as a whole, we could expect some tax rises or spending cuts over the next 50 years, averaging about 0.8% of what the UK economy produces in any one year. Under the most optimistic scenario for Scotland, that number would be more like 2% of national income, significantly greater than the figure for the UK.
Now, your figures have been dismissed, surprise, surprise, by the Scottish Government, who say Scots pay more in taxes per head than the rest of the UK. Would that make any difference to what you've said?
It is true that Scotland at the moment pays more per head in tax revenue than the rest of the UK, but that's entirely explained by oil revenue. Over the next 50 years, as that disappears, that would go, and Scotland would be left with the higher level of public spending that they currently enjoy, but without the higher level of tax revenues that they currently generate.
Now, in terms of spending, of course, the Scottish Government will argue that they would make different decisions to compensate for any loss of oil revenue. Is that a sustainable argument?
Certainly an independent Scotland could do a better job than the current UK government in terms of setting tax policy. The UK government does several things of our tax system which are far from desirable. So you could make a difference and do things better. What's highly unlikely is that you could do enough better things to generate enough growth to offset this fiscal challenge. We consider a range of scenarios, but even the most optimistic suggests that the challenge for Scotland would be far greater than the challenge that the rest of the UK would face.
So are you saying that an independent Scotland, a Scottish government there, would have to increase taxes further, or they'd have to lose some of those public spending commitments that they've had over the last few years?
Over the longer term, we can expect some combination of net tax rises or spending cuts for the whole of the UK. What we're saying is that those would be bigger in Scotland, even under our most optimistic scenario. So yes, some combination of tax rises or spending cuts would look likely.
Right, but public spending is high in Scotland, isn't it? So they could suffer disproportionately if they have to cut those public spending commitments. Scotland in the future could look very different than it does now.
It could. In some areas such as defence spending or aid spending, Scotland would be inheriting a relatively high level of spending compared to other countries. So that could be one area where they choose to make cuts. It could be that the spending on things like transport, economic development, social housing, where they spend a lot more than the rest of the UK, those kind of areas could be cut back.
Will independence basically mean the Scots having to pay back for their extraordinary level of spending on public services?
Well, essentially it would mean in the longer term they would have to finance that level of spending themselves. At the moment they are covering that through the higher oil revenues. Over the longer term in the UK, it's conceivable that the higher spending is maintained and financed by the UK government. Of course, if Scotland was independent, that option wouldn't be there. They would have to choose what level of tax they wanted and what level of spending they could enjoy. What they couldn't do is have higher levels of spending without higher levels of tax.
But is it difficult to predict exactly Scotland's economic future because of the variables like oil revenue that you talk about? All right, it is diminishing, but we don't know exactly what's going to happen to it or how quickly it will diminish, and also the level of debt that Scotland would inherit.
Certainly the fiscal position that Scotland has over the longer term is very sensitive to exactly how and when oil revenues decline, exactly what level of debt they inherit. So we consider a range of scenarios. The most optimistic, where we say that suppose Scotland gets half the debt the UK has, suppose that oil revenues follow the higher level as predicted by the Scottish Government for the next few years. Even under that more optimistic scenario, it still looks like the fiscal challenge facing Scotland would be considerably greater than that facing the rest of the UK.